a little bit of things like, what are some of the biggest mistakes? It's a bit of a best practice discussion for creating a business glossary that kind of ties people, wraps them around the axle, or makes them lose momentum. The first is trying to document data system specific info with glossary entries. Remember, everything in your glossary should be agnostic to the data system. If you want to document something specific about the data system, either put in a technical definition or just document it as supplemental info in the catalog. The other is dealing with definition collision paralysis. So we talked about this in the last session. If you've got more than one, if you can't agree on which one, if student athlete is defined by this or student athlete is defined by that, 9 times out of 10, you're actually talking about different contexts. And one of you is talking about the student athlete from a financial perspective, and one of you is talking about student financials based on what the NCAA says. And it's perfectly fine to create an NCAA student athlete definition and a Bursar student athlete definition, as long as they have reasonable context. So you can split the definitions by context as long as you name it differently. Having overcomplicated approval workflow. So our approval workflow had 2 steps: the functional data steward and the technical data steward. If you don't have people in those roles, or you don't think there's value, don't do it. Just auto approve by the person who's authored it, or have a 1-step approval. And you can kind of manage that and how you put the workflows. But if your goal is to get content in, don't worry too much about having infinite approval, because you can always come back and recommend a change. Not having good training or examples on good definitions, because people get really tight around the axle on how to write a definition. Stale glossaries, so creating things and never updating them. So having points of entry for changes or new content is incredibly important within a glossary, or else people will stop using it if the last update's been 10 years ago. Death by committee, authoring by meeting. So we showed you an example of Brenda creating a definition manually, and some people think that's the way to start. Like, oh, I'm gonna create I have my data governance council, and we're gonna meet bi-weekly, and we're gonna start working through definitions together. I recommend not to take that approach. Maybe to create some examples for people, but most of the time in that meeting, you're gonna have 18 people with nothing to talk about and 2 people with something to talk about, and it's a waste of time. So think about doing this asynchronously and focus on writing definitions as they come up. Not having buy-in or understanding to the return of this effort. So writing glossary definitions is hard. It's one of the hardest things you'll do, which is why we offer things like imports and community recommended things. But if you're asking people to do that and they don't understand why they're doing this effort, like what's the value of having this, who's ever going to use this, particularly if you kind of are just doing it to comply and don't plan to have anything else, then it's hard. So creating and defining the goals and letting people understand why they're doing it is really helpful. And then the last thing is mistakenly thinking glossaries are the easy part. Notice as we were authoring these, we were able to pull up and search on the catalog. We were able to pull information in. We were able to start in the catalog and get other content to help us write that. A lot of people think that the glossary is the easy part and they want to start with glossary and leave everything else for later. And that actually ends up with, you run out of momentum and people don't do that. But the more other content, and particularly automated, uncurated content you can pull in, the easier it is to do this curation bit. All right, that's it. Top 10 things. The general philosophy is that recommend to take continuous improvement over postponed perfection. So build as you go, as you need. Don't worry about having everything perfectly defined before you roll this out.